right. I think we're live. Hey everyone, happy Friday. Hope everyone's having a really great Friday here as we wrap up and enter the really beautiful weekend wherever you're at. Thanks for joining us wherever you're coming from, whether you're on YouTube or LinkedIn. We'll make some intros in a minute, but yeah, just want to welcome you all and also highlight a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today. And before I do, I want to make sure we talk a little bit about Q&A. So at the end of this presentation, we reserve about 15 minutes to answer any questions that you might have. So whether you're on YouTube or LinkedIn, feel free to just input comments, and we'll be able to pick those up here and hopefully answer them for you. We're really excited to present to you today a kind of a presentation with hopefully some assets that you can take away with you that cover a very consequential document in the industry of, let's say, Scan-to-BIM, and that is the request for proposal. We're going to be diving into it in a minute. And before we do, maybe we can do some introductions. Tyler, do you want to bring up the slides and then... take it from there. Let's see. Let's make sure. Oh, are you already? Yeah, you're already sharing yours. Sorry, I gotta bring these over.
Yeah, are you able to?
Yeah, this is
should be on the.
There we go. Here we go. Sweet, perfect. Actually, this is perfect. Okay, sorry, technical difficulty on the first-time users for these platforms. So, I guess we'll start off with some brief introductions. I'm George, head of product here at Integrative Projects. Like many of you that may be watching, I too come from the AEC industry and have spent most of my time working in technology in different places, having to do with how we communicate complex spaces and how we work together to build complex things in complex timelines, fast timelines, and also help in my before integrated projects, spending time on helping architects design complex businesses or help them manage complex projects. So that's me in a nutshell. And introduce Tyler.
Howdy, I'm Tyler. Tyler Putnam, head of solutions here at Integrated Projects. So just like George, I have a background in architecture. I'm registered here in New York City, and my entire career really has been bridging the intersection between technology and architecture, doing a lot of design technology consulting for companies like SOM and Robert Stern, KPF, etc. And now I'm really happy to join the Integrated Projects team to kind of interface between what our customers' pain points are and providing solutions with our product and platform team. So today's webinar is on the #1 RFP mistake that you're making. But before we actually get into that, and I would say we actually maybe have more like 30 different reasons why you're making mistakes and creating RFPs. But before we get into that, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. So first of all, what is an RFP? And how is it different than an RFI or like an RFQ, for instance? I think probably most people on the call probably know what a request for proposals is, but in case you don't, the request for a proposal is a pretty formalized process when a company is procuring contracts for services or products, and usually it's going to be responded by multiple parties. Sometimes these requests for proposals are legally obligated if you're doing like a federal contract or a government contract. In other cases, it's a good practice for large projects, so that you can get proposals from a wide variety of different vendors and kind of be able to bid level them against each other to select the right candidate. The RFI is a request for information, which usually happens inside the request for proposal process, especially if the request for proposal is not written very well and there's a lot of information, extra information that's needed for it. And then related is a RFQ, which is a request for qualifications. The RFI and the RFQ, we may end up doing webinars on those. Definitely love to hear everybody's feedback on what kind of topics you think would be the most helpful. So the request for proposals is an incredibly overwhelming process for those who are uninitiated, both on the managing side, but as well as writing proposals that to satiate the RFP. So 60% of businesses, of all businesses, actually report that the RFP process is too costly to even implement because it's really time intensive. It requires the coordination and input from multiple stakeholders. The larger the project, the more stakeholders that are going to be involved. It also requires a real technical domain expertise on what what service you're trying to procure. So in this case, laser scanning to building information modeling, as you can imagine, have a ton of different standards and technicalities and details that are needed in order to put together a statement of work and to evaluate the level of effort that it would take to accomplish this. So if you are a BIM manager or a VDC manager, maybe you're an owner operator or an asset manager, facilities manager, etc., this might not be your technical domain experience. So I guess, and then finally, the RFP sets up usually is the first activity inside of a project. Whether that's an acquisition or a renovation or construction project. And so when you add all of that together, the process of writing an RFP or answering an RFP is incredibly difficult. George, you want to talk about a little bit on sort of the process of RFP preparation?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, absolutely. So I think a really important piece of this is that we'll be expanding upon is it's just the fact that the RFP in itself is a very lengthy process. So in here, you just have about couple different steps at a very high level, right? You have to gather requirements. So what is it that we're going to be doing? All the context around that. In the case of what we do, which is mostly existing conditions or as-built, what kind of documentation do you already have, right? And so it's a very sort of context-finding mission that you're undertaking at the very beginning, and then from there, it's then assembling the RFP itself. So basically opening up whatever template you might have or not have, writing out the actual requirements, and making sure that you're covering all your bases basically with that proposal. Um, Finding the people then that you're going to request the proposal from. So sometimes there's platforms that allow you to post it on there in order to get wider distribution. Sometimes there's people that you've already worked with in the past, or new people that you've heard of through maybe webinars like this or other things. And then there's a waiting period for those proposals, and then you enter this kind of this loop or the RFI cycle, where different folks might try to fill in the gaps of the proposal itself by asking for more information. And that cycle, then you then disseminate basically those questions you might get to everybody, to give everyone a level playing field on the context, and then ultimately you end up hopefully aligning those proposals that you receive with some form of criteria, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And in that review process, ultimately you end up in awarding a contract. Now, and in that there might be some negotiation, etc. But that whole time between that beginning to end is a very lengthy amount of time, and it can go from weeks to months preparing that, or going through the entire process from beginning to end. And so what we want to impress upon you is that because it's so time intensive and there's so many people involved, that there's a very the downstream impact of not doing it right in the very beginning can be pretty detrimental or consequential in terms of the deadlines you might have or the expectations that you might be setting with various stakeholders. And so I think it's very important. We'll be just talking, basically beating this drumbeat throughout the rest of the presentation about how important actually RFPs are, in terms of ensuring success for outcomes and just making sure that you're not wasting time. Yeah, Tyler.
So to further down on the number one mistake that you're making in your RFPs is actually, in my opinion, just writing the RFP altogether. And we'll kind of double down on that. Sometimes it's a necessary evil, and in that case, we've developed some cheat sheets and some templates, and even some tools that we'll show off a little bit later. But if you are in the the unfortunate position to have to go through this really lengthy and arduous process of putting together an RFP, the one thing that you should really identify is that if you write a poor RFP, it means more than likely you're going to have poor project outcomes. So RFPs, as mentioned, it's like at the very beginning of the project. So if you don't have clear goals, scope, deliverables, accuracy requirements, then downstream there's going to be tremendous kind of ramifications for that. Further to that point, a poorly written RFP will actually disincentivize qualified bidders to even participate, and we'll dive into that a little bit more. But yeah, George, what else about this sort of multiverse of avoidable delays?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fun diagram to draw. Basically, just thinking about the going back to that kind of RFI cycle. The reality is that not every question might get covered, or maybe not the most important questions don't get covered because each vendor or stakeholder that's applying to that, that's writing the proposal, they might have expectations that they have already, different standards that they might have already, but it might not necessarily actually align with the expectations that the RFP writer might have. And so that is pretty consequential. And so what that means is that things that weren't captured in the RFI process or in that cycle could actually end up delaying the services side immensely. And there are some key ones that we've, a lot of this is through our own trials and tribulations in some sense of what we're sharing. But simple questions that like, who is the on-site POC, right? Or is there an on-site POC? Or like just even explaining further, like what are the expectations being set after the fact? All that kind of just prior information up front helps everyone that you're trying to work with provide better answers and hopefully lead to less delay. And so this kind of multiverse that happens is really about the kind of questions that you didn't think to answer up front. They all have different impacts on timeline. So on-site might not be as pretty as crazy, but let's say COI, certificate of insurance. Turns out lots of different building owners or building tenants, etc., like they have very different needs in terms of insurance, and those policies could actually take time to put together, or so all those things actually can delay schedules significantly. And so expectations that might have been agreed to at the very beginning or actually when the contract was awarded could end up leading to unexpected or for maybe foreseeable consequences. Is another way to look at it. And so at every point along that process of just mobilizing people on site and the logistics around that, it's important that some of the major items are covered upfront. And we know a little bit about that because we've done this many times, right? And so, in aggregate, in terms of our Scan-to-BIM services writ large, we've done services of this type over 5,000 locations. And so, we're really wanting to hopefully share and maybe open source some of what we've been facing to help in general, the community, right? We really care about just better outcomes for the building industry. And so, hopefully what you'll see today is a little bit of that effort materialize. But Tyler, do you want to talk more about?
Yeah, so I think probably everybody on the call has some experience with the Scan-to-BIM process, but I figured a little bit more housekeeping just to make sure that we're all on the same page when we're talking about, creating RFPs and proposals, scopes of work, and kicking off a Scan-to-BIM process. I mean, really, what are we talking about? And I'll kind of frame this in the way that we here at IPX think about it. We break it down. We break this whole process down into 3 simple steps. First, we scan the project. This could either be, you've already got an existing point cloud, at which point you can basically just upload to our service, or we will deploy a laser scanning professional, to your facility or your location, and reality capture, right? Millions of points, to then move on to step number 2, which is to convert that laser scan point cloud into a building information model, which is, and we're very opinionated about this, right? So George is from the AEC, AEC industry. I'm from the AEC industry. Almost all of us here at Integrated Projects kind of landed here because of the frustrations that we came to with various different poor outcomes in terms of standards, from this entire process. So we have a very rigorous, opinion, standards, and QA/QC process to deliver our building information models. And finally, step number 3 is the entire order management and delivery mechanism is on our IPX platform, which is a SOC 2 secure compliant platform, where you can get all of the reality capture, existing conditions information at your fingertips, where you can view these, share them, download them, report on them, and even push it out to your Autodesk Construction Cloud account as well. So here it's just kind of some visuals about the laser scanning process. We are hardware agnostic, but we have tons of industry channel partners, and certainly have some preferences. On the right here, this is Navis VLX. It's one of our favorites to scan with. It's kind of a crazy RoboCop looking SLAM-based reality capture device. And then in terms of converting that scan into the building information model, we have quite a sophisticated process that is very much informed with various pipeline automations, machine learning, as well as engineer in the loop, QA/QC, verified until it meets our standards and specifications, at which point it's uploaded to our free platform. So this is a free viewer in the cloud. It can be accessed from anywhere. That you can basically view any of these assets, including the DWGs, the IFC files, the Revit files, the point cloud, the virtual tours. And you can share this with other project stakeholders that, say for instance that they're not technical users and they don't have AutoCAD or Revit, but they still, need to do area takeoffs and get measurements, and kind of query the space. And we're doing that on a, very large variety of different space types, as well as sizes, right? So all the way from, really small 5,000 square feet, where we're turning these things around in, less than a week, all the way to, extra large facilities, million square foot plus. And I think at this point we've got, I want to say 27 different space types that we have categorized, the over 5,000 projects that we've done. And all of this is really circling back and informing our standards. And we get a lot of RFPs. The industry is flooded with RFPs. We are on the receiving end of a lot of these, and unfortunately, they are really difficult to respond to most of the time because they're poorly structured and poorly written. And as a result, we've just seen it time and time again that the entire process of the RFP generation is overwhelming, but it can also delay the project, and ultimately, if it's not done well, the projects will have significant challenges.
So ultimately, then, what makes for a good RFP? And I think one of the things that's really important to note is that because of let's say, the lack of being able to respond to a really good RFP, businesses on the other side are losing out. And so it's an entire ecosystem, right? And so an interesting stat here about 1 in 5 companies, they lose over 725,000 a year in revenue just because they're unable to respond to certain RFPs received, whether that's because they choose to decline them or choose to and maybe answer them not in the best light or not in the best way. And so a couple of sections, we're going to walk through a couple of different sections here that really make for a good RFP. And at the end, we'll also kind of share some assets here that will help folks do that. But really important to start is a very good project background. So setting the context for where is this located? Where is this project located? What does the site encompass? What's the actual scope? So even if it were to be like say a hospital, right? Getting more context that it's not the entire building, that it's a certain floor, getting down to the level of square footage, right? Like how many square feet? Because interestingly enough, a lot of the logistics around how one actually starts to scan these locations is actually more at a square foot level than it is and so there's a relationship between square footage, the amount of area one has to cover, the amount of area one has to scan, and time, right? And so and it's kind of this interesting function of like square footage times let's say divided by the number of square feet that a hardware device can capture at any given sort of run. And all that basically tells you, well, one person, it might take them 8 hours to do the scan if they're using certain hardware, but it might also take 2 days if they're using another type of hardware. And that is also in relationship to maybe the other requirements that we'll talk about in a minute. But this is the more this information you have up front, the better, because the flip side of what happens is that and we just seen this time and time again, is that without that kind of information up front that is set by the RFP writer, then assumptions are made by folks like us as to, okay, what do we mean? We might ask for more information, etc. But again, like all that can be done up front, then in some sense we can answer those questions really quickly. And I think for everyone involved, sort of the speed and turnaround time is really important, right? If we talked a little bit earlier, weeks to months, right? So what can we do to help all vendors answer questions sooner, compress that time, therefore like we can actually hit the ground running faster or hit the better outcome. So project background is one thing. The rough area square footage is really important, even down to certain areas and potential scopes. So as an example, a bad RFP might just say, here's an address of a building, and we want to do the third floor, second floor, and there's no mention about area. And then what you might end up learning later is that actually it's the third floor, but it's only a room. Well, now you were maybe overquoted, right? And so there's another back and forth as to how you're being quoted because we're not being specific enough. So even getting down to like what are the rooms and what are the specific things that you want to be digitized from those rooms, that's all very, very critical. And the more you can outline that need up front, the better. And then another section to have that's really helpful is an evaluation criteria. So how are all the vendors then going to be judged, and helping everyone understand what are your sort of criteria for selection is very helpful, because then we know what to emphasize, where not to emphasize, where to highlight the strengths, where to highlight the weaknesses relative to what's important to you. Because you can imagine that otherwise that lack of clarity really doesn't it might detract certain vendors from actually applying, because they might not understand that this is part of the criteria and therefore not want to, but it is actually super helpful. And so even for it's almost like a best practice in general to have an evaluation criteria for any kind of vendor, like what kind of matters to you, or have that as part of the process. Because a lot of the folks, as just one last note, is that might let's say hire us, they're typically like somewhere between um, either they're a step between themselves and the ultimate client, like let's say they're an architecture firm or a construction firm, and then the client. Having that evaluation criteria that you guide your client through is actually also a signal of expertise from your perspective, right? And so having these criteria in place actually goes all the way upstream to clients and shows that there's a kind of level of sophistication that's happening all the way through, which is net benefit for everyone. So yeah, I think that's really, really, really critical. What else do we need for a good RFP, Tyler?
So we haven't all talked about the scope of work, which is usually what people think about in terms of the request for proposal, right? It's, I need my building or my campus of buildings to be scanned. What's the scope of work? And everything that George just mentioned is all the framing and the context that you have to spell out in great detail even before we get to the scope of work. And the scope of work needs to include actually a lot of really technical things here. And if you can't convey sufficient detail in the RFP, you'll get proposals back that are all over the map. And that's why it's really important to actually have solidified your evaluation criteria and have some kind of strategy around, okay, if I'm going to ask 5 different vendors for quotes, are they all apples to apples? And how can I essentially bid level all of the proposals that I get back? From our experience, taking a look at all the RFPs that we've responded to and that we've also issued out, it can go from 1x to 20x in terms of the pricing, right, all over the map, depending upon how much information is actually captured in the request for proposal. So I'll just touch on a couple things here. Obviously, we don't have time to really dive into like all the granularity for how to write a great RFP, but we're actually going to give you some cheat sheets that essentially make this super easy for you anyway. So industry standards. The 2 things that you always want to specify is level of detail 300 per Building Smart Alliance, right? They have the most robust kind of definition around the building information model, and that essentially captures, and because this is existing conditions only, you want to really specify that this is geometrically, spatially, and quantitatively. What level of detail is the building information model, or BIM, going to be developed to? The other one that you want to specify is level of accuracy 20 per USIBD. If your project is over 50,000 square feet, or if it's a complex MEP, perhaps LOA 30. But this is another set of guidelines that's on the scanning side. It's how many dots are being captured, and to what sufficient detail and resolution, right? And you can imagine that there's reality, there's the physical space, then there is the reality capture, which is one layer of abstraction, right? One delta of discrepancy from reality. And then there's the building information model, which is yet another abstraction and another order removed, right? So in terms of getting a good, accurate product down the line, you want to be able to specify in great detail what these things are. Now, common pitfalls are not really knowing the 50 plus standards and buzzwords out there in the industry, and not having a real technical domain experience, or maybe not really understanding what the project goals are in total, and over specifying, right? So when I get a proposal and I hear things like COBie, like ISO 19650, like NBIMS, like NBS, BIMOS, like Uniclass, all of these things, when it comes to an existing conditions model, are almost always overspecified. And funny enough, right, whenever you hear about these things, it's because there's some function downstream of, usually digital twin or something else. But if the goals of those projects are not explicitly defined, and if you don't already have COBie standards developed, or these other things, and you're not like concretely specifying what you need and what they're going to be used for, what ends up happening is everybody on the proposal submission side is basically just going to inflate contingency line items to avoid for, or to compensate basically for the lack of information. So rule of thumb, always go with LOD and LOA. The other ones only specify, if you actually need them. Other things, your firm standards, right? If you need templates and families, anything aligning to your BIM execution plan, etc. Of course, make sure to get all of that into the RFP, and be as detailed as possible. And lastly, this is something that we actually come up against all the time, which is you don't want to set up a project and not understand like site access issues or logistics, or if things like a certificate of insurance are going to be a requirement, or if there's a background check, or I recently went to a facility where I had to bring my birth certificate, which is crazy, but it happens, right? The more upfront that you can be, and you can actually include these things in the RFP, the better chance that everybody is going to feel when they're responding to it. And as a result, it's naturally going to drive the price down because it's going to be more articulate. The other big thing that I want to point out here is if you've got a space which is either multi-floor or it's larger than 20,000 square feet, you always want to specify for a geospatial survey that ties at least 4 control points per floor into some kind of state plane, whether that's Nav 88 or another one. Depends on your location. If you don't do this, if you don't have survey control points, then it doesn't matter what LOD 300 you're at or the LOA 20, right? The chance for what's called scan drift is going to be very risky, very risky. So always include that. Now, that's all a lot of stuff, right? And we certainly don't have, we don't have 10 hours to do a master's session on how to actually write, the world's greatest RFP. So what is IPX doing, or integrated projects doing, to help out with this? Well, we got 3 things for you today. The first one, and my favorite, is just skip the RFP process altogether. If you don't need to do it, don't do it. There's tremendous reasons why. Now, when are you going to be in a situation that you don't have to do an RFP. You're not doing government projects. You don't have a company-wide policy. You're not dealing with unions, et cetera, et cetera. But also that you have some other vendor relationship or preferred partner that you've already got a master service agreement with, or their standards altogether. The second thing that we got for you today is we have a couple of RFP templates and checklists, and I'll jump into those in a second. And lastly, I'm super excited about this, but we just recently hacked together a beta version of the RFP, what we're calling an RFP generator tool. Now this is in beta, so we're going to do a live demo, and we'll see how that goes. But really excited about that.
Awesome. Maybe I can kind of showcase some of this stuff.
Yeah.
So going back to the just kind of ordering through us, basically one of the things that we really worked hard on is simplifying the ordering experience, such that some of the answers that you might be looking for already from an RFP can be upfront and handled accordingly. And so there are two kind of different forms in which we're doing that. One of which is the simplified ordering process, and then the other one is a more assistive workflow. The assisted one is one we're very excited about. This one is more internal at this point. Basically, when you place an order through for Scan It, even in this kind of self-service form, we still kind of will typically ask follow-up questions and iron them out here. But what you're seeing on the screen ultimately is a way to be able to get down to specific floors and input all the information that you need to capture at even the area level. So area meaning it could be a room, it could be a certain just open amount of square footage, but being able to provide even descriptions at that level such that when it all is aggregated, you have real-time pricing, right? And so this is actually one of the things we really want to handle is the kind of complexity that exists when it comes to ordering. And capturing what we've learned over the years, actually doing this to the benefit of teams. So if you just want to even mock up potentially a potential scheme that you can then ultimately download as a spreadsheet, that is something that we are in the kind of midst of rolling out. And the other one that was just previous to this one was a more self-service aspect, which is just very simple. We ask a less amount of questions, but it helps us to understand very quickly and give you a rough order amount with a schedule. So very critical to note, right? Transparency in pricing, transparency in schedule. It is our ambition to make that very seamless. The same way that you might order a car on Carvana or a Tesla, that kind of navigated experience where you also know when you're going to get something. That is ultimately what we're striving for. And so all this is in service too of just minimizing order anxiety. If you're a part of our last webinar 2 weeks ago, we talked heavily about order anxiety. All that is again really in service of that. And then I think, yeah.
So
checklist?
that's great if you can get around the RFP process. But what happens if I need to go out to bid with at least 3 different vendors? I'm working on a federal project, right? And I need to actually do an RFP. Well, we've got you covered there too. So first we put together, right, and this is all informed by the over 5,000 projects that we've done. We put together a simple Scan-to-BIM RFP checklist. Okay, these are the 10 things that if you're writing an RFP or if you just wrote one, if you just issued one, just go through this checklist and just make sure that all these points are hit. Most of the RFPs that I have received, and by most I mean almost all of them, don't hit all of these points. But if you can hit all of these points, the quality of the responses that you're going to get back are going to be way greater. Okay, but let's go beyond that. What if you don't want to really write an RFP from scratch? Well, we've got you covered there as well. We put together basically an ideal Scan-to-BIM RFP. Obviously, we're biased, so if you fill it out, send it to us, include us on the list. But honestly, use this for procuring any other Scan-to-BIM company or services as well. So this is a 15-page document that checks the boxes on all of all of those the RFP checklist, and specifies what we think. Of course, we're opinionated, but what we think are the most crucial information to specify inside the RFP, and then we have an additional kind of section for appendices for various different other things. So if you wanted to include things for digital twin, for Kobe, for BIM level 2, different things like that, you can attach them there. So this is a good template to just get you, get you started, get you going off the bat. And we'll be providing a link to all of these as well through this webinar. The last template that we got for you is this is kind of a mouthful, but it's our RFP bid leveling criteria matrix. Now, what is that? When you're going out to bid it, or if you're developing an RFP, by definition, it means you should at least be sending it to 3 different vendors, which means that you now have to evaluate vendor 1 from vendor 2 from vendor 3. In some cases, it might be 5 vendors, and in others, 10 vendors. Likely, if you have to go through an RFP process, it means that the project that you're working on is very complicated or large, which by definition means that there's going to be a lot of stakeholders, both internal project stakeholders, client-side stakeholders, as well as stakeholders on the scanning side. So you have to select someone. So what do? Well, usually what everybody does is they look at all the bids and then they select the lowest price. But what you actually want to do is you want to focus on who can solve your problems with the least risk, not necessarily the lowest bidder. Okay, that's great, but how do you do that? Well, we put together the 10 most critical criterias that we think a good Scan-to-BIM contractor should be able to provide. And you'll notice that cost and pricing structure is in here, but so are things like experience or technology and equipment, project management and capacity, data accuracy and quality control, turnaround time and responsiveness, sustainability and innovation, right? There's a whole host of various different criteria, and not all criteria are as important as the next one. And so this is where the weighting comes in. So under here, this is an Excel spreadsheet, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that. We'll probably fold this into a tool at some point, but or into an automated tool on our platform. But basically, we've got a scoring of each of these different criteria, 1 to 10, and then it's weighted by a certain percentage. So what you do with this is you get all the stakeholders who are going to be making the decision, and you don't have to use all 10. Maybe only 5 matter to you. Maybe only 3 matter to you, right? But basically what you do is you unanimously around the room, democratically say, okay, how important is experience when we're evaluating the contractor? And these percentages will all equal up to 100%. So we say, okay, 20% for experience, 15% for equipment and technology, so on and so forth. How important is cost? How important is speed? All these various different things. If you really wanted to be objective about this, you anonymize the companies and you just look at the proposals, and then around the table, you just take the average of the votes of every project stakeholder and you say, okay, this is a 5, experience is an 8, technology and equipment is a 10, so on and so forth. Sounds like a lot, but in my experience, you can actually host one of these. I remember hosting one of these for over $1 million RFP where we had 10 different contractors, and I was able to get this entire thing done and objectively come out with a score that ranked the most aligned vendor with our company. This was previous to integrated projects, but that took about 45 minutes to an hour, I think. So yeah, we've got links for this as well. But all of that is very manual. So we want to show you kind of a sneak peek on something that we are building. So George, can you pull this up?
Yep, super excited to share this. So, just to set expectations, this tool is not yet available. We are currently developing it, looking to get feedback from existing clients of ours, and yeah, in general. But what we're going to show you is pretty promising to begin with. So, the idea here is to have this available for anyone to use. It's a free RFP generator. And what it will do is it will just take some simple inputs and just start to fill out a kind of pre-existing template here that basically captures the template that we were offering as well as a separate document, and just starts to kind of replace some of the fields in it. In the future, it could be that our clients themselves already have, let's say they want to create an RFP and maybe they want to find additional folks to apply to it. They will still be able to maybe take some of the answers that they've already inputted, so they don't have to redo the work. So, again, really just in service of helping everyone, yeah, just get better project outcomes. And so, part of this would be something like being able to pick what kind of service it is that you're looking for ultimately, the amount of square footage that the space might be in, and then even be able, at least from our perspective, already start to offer some context as to what it might look like or might cost. And then from that, then be able to just even input like a project address, where you can see, you can start to collect some information. Let's just say something in Gulfport, and we'll start to populate the actual template with this information. You could input, let's say it's ACOM, like an example, and then just continue to add some of this information in here. Even things like the issue date, response deadline for the RFP, and then start to kind of populate this as well. And so, and the idea here being that we just make it much more simple to do this over time. And at the end, you can either print from here or download to a Word doc to finalize it or bring it into your own template. So yeah, really excited about this. If you have any questions, suggestions about this in general, please feel free to reach out to me, George at integratedprojects.co. Very happy to take any kind of feedback or anything else. And but yeah, it's really, really exciting. I think we haven't really come across many of these ourselves, and I think ultimately, if we can help provide anyone in the building industry a better means to request information from us, the better. So yeah, really, really excited. Let's see. Do we have? Let's see. What else were we sharing? Do you want to bring back up the presentation?
Yeah, you want me to pull it back up?
Yeah,
no worries. Cool. Yeah, so we're super excited about this RFP generation tool. Really looking forward to anybody's feedback on the evaluation criteria matrix, on the checklist, on the proposal template itself, and also all of this is basically going to inform this this tool that we're building. So yeah, super interested to hear people's feedback. These are some quotes from customers that that we work with on a daily basis, and we would love to expand and see how we can support any of your projects in terms of reality capture and building information modeling. So with that, of course, you can meet with our solutions team anytime. scan the QR code that'll take you to a link directly to my calendar or Jose's calendar, our founder and CEO. Email us, go to our website, LinkedIn, anything like that. And I want to open it up for questions, but I do want to mention that we have our next webinar, which is going to be on March 27th, which is going to be an update on our main core IPX product and platform updates. We kind of just revamped mostly the back end of our whole IPX platform, but a lot of other very cool things there. So that'll be hosted by George, and yeah, looking forward to seeing everyone there. But I'd like to open it up for questions if anybody's got them.
We already got one. Jabari, how do you prefer feedback? Emails, LinkedIn? We take feedback from anywhere. Emails would be great. Just email us directly. You can also drop. We do have like a chat bot. So if there's feedback you want to provide there, we're also kind of monitoring that, so we can definitely answer through that. LinkedIn, you can DM us, post questions. Anywhere and everywhere, we're around to answer them. So thanks for asking that. I do want to, as maybe as other questions trickle in, I'm very curious, Tyler. Since you have you don't have to name names, but I'm very curious in terms of like some of the outcomes you've seen in which, like, maybe you can just highlight a story of something that happened when there was just some of the critical information that we're covering in the template was not provided, and for whatever reason things got fell into the cracks, etc. Like it just wasn't asked by anyone, and therefore, like, what can you just describe like some of the situations that can happen?
Yeah. So the first one that I will mention, and I won't name names or any projects, but the first one that I'm going to mention is that we don't respond to every RFP that we get. Not to say that we're super choosy or snobs about the RFP, but some of them that we get, just straight up don't have enough information that we feel confident that we can actually respond to. And whenever there's, the more doubt that we have or lack of confidence in what we're actually being asked to do, the higher our prices are going to be and the longer our timelines are going to be, right? And I know that that's not just us. We have a ton of scanning partners, BIM modeling partners around the industry. It's the case everywhere. So I got one very large, very hefty, really cool project that outlined some pretty amazing, potentially amazing project goals that I know is not even kicked off and is delayed about 4 months at this point because there isn't a competent bidder hasn't been selected, and we basically bowed out of it. So that's the first one, right? Is you write a bad RFP and you're not going to get contractors. Yeah, I mean, I could go on with other ones, but
I'm actually very curious too, just about maybe to just push in on the controls side. And this is a question that I think about sometimes. Like, what if the client doesn't want controls? What do you like?
yeah,
If you just have to kind of surmise, like what are the challenges that could be expressed? I sometimes think that some of these things
yeah,
when I hear it are typically expressions of a symptom of something else.
yeah.
That they're not just like for its own sake. And so, yeah, curious what you think about that, and then I might respond with mine if it differs.
Yeah, for sure. There's a phrase that I use a lot, which is you're either going to pay for it up front
Mm.
or you're going to really pay for it on the back end. And when it comes to survey controls, our best practice is if your project is over 20,000 square feet, or if it's multiple floors, you want to set some kind of survey control. There's various different standards for survey controls. So, you don't have to go like super crazy all the time. Um, you know, Happy to jump on any calls so that we can really understand what the project is and what we would recommend. But um, and I mentioned this to clients, very often. I'm like, we run a risk of the accuracy coming back, where like we'll have to actually go back to site and scan. Obviously, there's a level of effort with that, resources, right? So there's sort of the question about compensation or who's liable for that. And then obviously that impacts the project timeline, right? Uh, Typically, the reason why a client wouldn't want to do survey controls or why they would push back is because it is another service to coordinate, but we can help on that, right? The other one is that it is an added cost, which we have a very well defined, as you can imagine, calculator for determining the cost of survey controls. And the other thing is that it takes time. So before and that time usually does impact the critical path of the project schedule, right? It's like it's got to be done even before we can do the laser scanning. But yeah, I'll say it again. You either pay for it up front or you pay for it on the back end.
Hmm. Yeah, I think in part, and yeah, that's a really great answers. I think in part it's also the sense that for some of these things that are somewhat technical, um, advising the client on educating them on like what is the benefit of it. I think that what happens maybe sometimes is different firms really understand their strengths very well, and so they understand what their domain is.
Mm-hmm.
And if those firms are somewhat conduits for the work of others, then they're also kind of selling in some sense and educating on behalf of others. And what that might break down is that if there's pushback, there's folding, right? It's like, oh, well, the client says, well, what's this line item? Oh, well, this controls up accuracy. Do we really need it? And then because there's that gap of like maybe full deep understanding of what that is, and it actually, I wouldn't even say it's at the firm level. It really is at the kind of individual level. Like it's actually at the level of a project manager and their awareness and overall understanding of what's happening that can actually impact the consequences. And so if there's not enough education and training as to like the sort of the downstream impacts of different decisions, then the project manager very understandably is not well equipped to push back and to say, actually, no, we really, kind of line in the sand. Out of anything, controls are actually super critical over this because of the fact that, at this level of a project, we have so many different, because the reality is that there's only more vendors, right? There's only like what we've seen over the past, this is a hobby horse of mine, but basically like what we've seen over the past 20 years is continued fragmentation of services. The same thing that's happened in healthcare with like the rise of HMOs meant you need more specialists, and so more money, more expense, et cetera. And so that's happening because of many factors, including liability in the AEC industry. And so now you have this plethora of boutique firm of more and more like us, right? Because to kind of offload and specialize. And the reality is that there's now an overhead for people that are kind of in between to actually understand the work of the downstream impacts of all these other stakeholders, where it might have been just one company doing everything. The reality is now it's many. And so it really is important that some of these things almost kind of be on by default, until technology changes on the other side, where like maybe controls aren't necessary. But it is important, and for us it's important that we help educate customers. We see it as our responsibility to advocate for these things up to our best ability, right? Ultimately, we cannot control the client's decisions, and but we want to make sure we're advocating for the reality, like, hey, we will
Mm-hmm.
do it if if it, under the best, let's say, possible, with the best level of care, etc. But if these things aren't in place because it's been rejected, well, then there's challenges that are going to arise from that. And I think everyone can resonate and nod their head probably that's listening with this idea that timelines are only getting more constrained. But I do wonder if it's almost like this collective lack of pushing back to the realities of building with so many stakeholders now.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so it's a large rant, but I just think that there's a lot there that we need to help educate, collectively as an industry, clients who might not understand sort of where technology is going, and therefore the impact of like how we coordinate today is not how it was coordinated 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I know that we're at time now, but I do want to respond to that because I think something valuable. The way to think about controls, if you're a project manager and you have to communicate sort of the value proposition for survey controls, don't tell them it's going to reduce accuracy, et cetera, et cetera. Pitch it as though it is an insurance premium.
Hmm.
And it's actually a very small level of effort and cost at the very beginning of the project compared to the substantial downstream ramifications that could happen to a project schedule, right?
Hmm.
Frame it in those terms from the cost benefit scenario.
There's and then we can drop, but there's this like thing about it's like Six Sigma or one of these things, like the sins of waste or
Yeah.
something, and like one of them is one of the most notorious ones is just rework.
Totally.
So like, how do we minimize rework? Like, how do we sort of maybe measure twice, cut once, but like that little bit of upfront effort put at the very beginning, again, even with all the way to the RFP, is basically the whole headline here. Is like so much of what happens downstream is actually a symptom of what happens at the very beginning of a process. So how do we, and one thing we would advocate for, again, with this, in this interest of transparency, with like the RFP template and the feedback hopefully we get from the community, is that consider somewhat of an open source product, right? We want the feedback to make this template better. And hopefully, we're not saying that it needs to be like, there's no consortium here. It doesn't need to be this like, stamp of ISO or et cetera. It's just like something that will at least help people communicate a little bit better at the benefit of everyone. So Tyler, thank you so much for walking us through that. It was really fun putting this together with you.
Thank you.
And really thankful for everyone that was able to join us, and hopefully those that are rewatching this at some later date. Hope you're all well, and have a great rest of your week or weekend. Cheers, everyone.
Awesome. Cheers.
Bye.